Hello and welcome back to the Overseers. My name's Proelios and I'm joined as usual by my co-host Nightwing. We have finally kicked things off with season 5 of the Overwatch League and we are going to go over a few interesting topics in this episode. Just share our thoughts on 5v5 Overwatch in the professional scene, discuss the initial meta that the Overwatch League has adopted, uh, just give our brief thoughts on the winners and losers of week 1, and then share some predictions of ours going into week 2. So let's just kick things off by acknowledging that season 5 has finally begun. Like, holy crap, we were waiting for it for so long. The off season was brutally long, and it just feels incredible to have the league back with us. Um, I have had a couple of rough weeks and have been feeling quite down, but the Overwatch League restarting has just like livened things up a bit for me and just boosted my mood a lot. So thank God for that. And naturally, all the entertainment, all the pro personalities coming back to us at the very entertaining and intuitive desk. It's just been really fun to have that back. What are your general thoughts about the league returning, Nightwing?
Yeah, I mean, it's great to have the league back. I think a little bit of the excitement was sort of bogged down just because of all the tech issues that they've been having, uh, which is a bit unfortunate. But the league has been moving to like a separate production company, I think, based in Toronto. Then there's all kinds of weird stuff happening where the feed is then sent back to California and then it's broadcasted. So because of that, you had all these FPS issues, which I think made us lose a lot of viewers who were excited to watch Overwatch 2. So I think that's a missed opportunity, but it was actually nice to see the league in action when you could actually see what's happening on screen. And yeah, how teams have, you know, gone into this new season with new rosters is just really fun to watch. Just like it is with every year, but with the extra excitement of 5v5 and a few surprises coming out from teams here and there.
And just speaking of tech issues, we have a one over ourselves with Nightwing not having access to his usual mic right now. But I think that's less of a concern. If Owl can get away with broadcasting games at 30 FPS, I think we are Gucci for now. Um, all right, 5v5. The league has finally moved on to Overwatch 2, and I think the pro game has changed a fair bit just because of that one tank, like one less tank on either side. Um, I feel like the game's goal, like at least at the pro level, has changed from having a sort of a battle of attrition to simply making more mechanical outplays. Like you would normally see in 6v6, players just poking at each other until they consume certain cooldowns and then going in aggressively. We don't see as much of that in Overwatch 2. I think one reason being that there is simply one less player, so one less set of cooldowns you need to worry about. Secondly, the amount of peel and defensive power in the game has gone down, um, which means you can afford to play a bit more aggressively in general. And thirdly, I just think that it's easier for the pros to play the mechanical game rather than playing for resources. Because like if you play a waiting game, someone might just use some cooldowns in a really effective way and eliminate you. And just losing one player, like even right now, is like as big of a disadvantage as it was in Overwatch 1. So those are my general thoughts on 5v5, and I want to get yours as well, Nightwing.
Yeah, I mean, I think peel has definitely reduced, and so you would actually see, especially from those support players who were rumored to be having a rough time in Overwatch 2. You could see that Lucios and Anas would actually play quite separately instead of trying to peel for each other, because Lucio Ana was the main support duo that most people were playing. Uh, a lot of the times, Lucios would just leave their Anas to die. Either you regenerate through the support player's passive, or you would just have to fend for yourself. So I think it is like a definitely a change in the paradigm of how the game is played. But I also think that it did allow for a lot more individual plays. Uh, Players did get away with a lot of interesting things. For example, you would see Sir Majid from the Florida Mayhem and Ultraviolet from the Atlanta Rain go for these insane Ana flank nades, similar to what Twilight did a few times in the past few years. Uh, Except that you can do that sort of thing much more often now that you have that healer passive, so you can use your anti nades more aggressively. Uh, and obviously, other players can also go for these real hero plays. You could see uh, players like Nero getting 5Ks even. And I think that makes the game a lot more interesting to watch, especially if you're a fan of a particular player. Individual performances do stand out, and that also means that better players get noticed and they're not relegated to contenders as often if they actually do perform well. So I think that is like a great advantage of 5v5. Um, Obviously, that war of attrition isn't there, but that's also what made a lot of Overwatch gameplay kind of boring, if I'm being honest. I think the fact that more fights happen more frequently means you can see more action in a shorter amount of time. So that's, I think, still very interesting. I think teams still have the potential to snowball. They have the ability to dominate. It's not always just who clicks whose head first. We're not at a CS:GO or Valorant level of that even right now. So I think there is a good balance between team play and individual play, probably better than it was in Overwatch 1 because there's not so much mitigation happening anymore. So I think I'm still excited to see what happens. The game is, to be honest, a little bit hard to figure out when you're watching, but I think a lot of it has to be attributed to the fact that the game is new, and also there were tech issues to the point where you can't really figure out what's going on because there's a lot of visual clutter on screen due to the low resolution and low FPS. I think once you've got a stable 1080p 60 FPS stream going, the game will be easier to see, and it will be actually possible to follow.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much hoping that these tech issues are resolved by next week, which is I think in a couple of days. They've had a bit of time to figure that out now, so I don't think it's an really an excuse anymore to be giving viewers 30 FPS streams in the year 2022. So anyway, let's move on and talk about the meta that we saw in this past week. I think it's still a really very raw meta. We are definitely going to see it evolve like we do almost every time in the Overwatch League. But I think there are a lot of nuances that some of us paid attention to. And Nightwing, can you just share some of the different compositions that you found interesting and just would like to tell our viewers about?
So the initial reports that came out from leaks from the alpha where the pros did play was that Zarya was a very like dominant hero. However, you saw that when put into practice, many Zarya players and teams playing Zarya comps were actually struggling. Even the Dallas Fuel, when they put in Hanbin, who was rumored to be one of the contenders for MVP this year, he pretty much fell flat on his face trying to play that Zarya comp. And other players that are not even as skilled as Hanbin also tried the same thing, and they also struggled mostly. The NYXL put Keller on Zarya. I did not love that whatsoever, if I'm being honest. Uh, so I think that's a comp that probably has to be just relegated to the books for now. The most dominant comp that you actually saw was that Winston, Genji, Soldier, Ana, Lucio comp, which is quite similar to Dive, except that the Soldier is not quite as dive heavy and does provide a lot of sustained damage. Soldier has been nerfed ever since that that particular patch that the Overwatch League is playing on. So on live, he's toned down now. But for the kickoff clash, as far as I understand, he will be quite a dominant pick, honestly, because of all that damage he does and the fact that he can fend for himself with that biotic healing field, of course. So that's one of the major comps that got played, and uh, teams like the Shock especially dominated on that sort of comp. The Atlanta Rain as well. You could also see the Doom comps come out from a couple of teams. One of the most prominent examples being the uh, Doomfist comp coming out of the Houston Outlaws, where they 3-0'd the Dallas Fuel with that comp. But then over time that got figured out, and the Toronto Defiant actually played a good tracer to counter the Echo and the Doom in that comp, with Pelican playing the Echo. So I think that's a comp that is actually quite viable at times and does create a lot of space and has a lot of momentum in maps and game modes such as push, where you have to constantly push the cart and also set up, dynamic positioning instead of holding chokes. So that's a great comp for that sort of situation. And then you've got the rush comp that was played by teams like the London Spitfire pretty much exclusively. That's a comp that does actually still work in some areas, and they did look quite good on that sort of comp on maps like Kings Row that favor that rush style. I feel like in Overwatch 2, especially in maps and game modes like Push, you will sort of struggle to make that comp work. However, if that's what you're good on, then honestly, it's better to rely on that sort of comp instead of trying to play a comp that you don't know how to play. So that's, I think, some of the major comps. There was a little bit of Hog and Diva being played here, no Orisa whatsoever. But yeah, I think tanks still do determine sort of how the comps are played, if I'm being honest, even if there's only one tank on the field now.
Yeah, there is a good bit of experimentation going on in the league right now, and I think that has led to a lot of distinct styles for a lot of different teams, at least in week one. You can generally see a lot of high mobility comps being played with the Winston and the Doomfist. I think the Atlanta Rain and the Houston Outlaws definitely showed the effectiveness of playing Doomfist comps. Um, and a lot of teams did play that Winston as well, because I think he's one of the few tanks that was actually um, he didn't lose out a lot going into Overwatch 2. He can still be a really good solo tank, unlike characters like Hog and Diva, which are really situational picks, even Sigma to some extent. We also saw the Sigma come out a little bit, like for example from Space, when they were playing that Circuit Royale map, Circuit Royale, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I think you pretty much covered all that, Nightwing. So I think let's move on and talk about the biggest winners of week one. And so Nightwing and I have just picked one team each that we thought did well in week one, or at least one out in week one. So we're just going to talk about those. And my pick was the LA Gladiators. Now, the LA Gladiators won both their games. They played against the NYXL as well as the Boston Uprising, I believe. And even though they weren't like this fantastic invulnerable team, they did do a lot of things right, and I think their DPS had a lot to do with that, especially Kevster, who is naturally a hyperflex and not only played a really good Soldier 76 but also flexed onto the Genji when Face brought in Ans to play that Widowmaker on maps like Gibraltar. And they also had a good support rotation going on, with naturally Shu being the mainstay, and then Funny Astro playing the Lucio, and Skewed coming in for the Zen or the Brigitte. So I think the Gladiators are one of the few teams that have figured their player rotations out fairly well in the beginning of the season. I think even Rhino has been a good addition to the team so far. He hasn't been this kind of god tier playmaker, but I think he's been a really stable main tank, kind of like Muse was. With so the Gladiators seem to have maintained their style, and naturally they've got two wins. They are looking fairly consistent, even though not unbeatable. But I kind of feel like that's bound to happen uh, so early on in Overwatch 2. So I think as time goes on, we will find out which teams are more meta proof and just better at learning than the others, I guess. Which was your winner from week one, Nightwing?
I think for me, it has to be the Atlanta Rain. This team comes out with a completely new look with Hawk on the Doomfist, which is not something you actually expect. I mean, other teams such as the Houston Outlaws actually utilize Dante, who's a DPS player, on tank instead. And that's what a lot of other teams have been apparently trying in scrims as well. But the Atlanta Rain comes out with Hawk. He has a better disciplined Doom than Dante, honestly, because he times his engages better. He doesn't just go and insta feed like you saw Dante do sometimes. He's not in that. like sacrificial sort of mentality. He actually creates a lot of space and then backs out and continues to hold that space for the team, which I thought was a really impressive way of uh, looking at how Doom was played. I think he also gave a shout out to Get Quaked On, which is just a base thing to do, because he has apparently been like one of the main contributors to the Doomfist feedback in Overwatch 2, which I think was great. Um, yeah, and Nero played a really good Genji. I think people sort of were a bit down on Nero for some reason after last year because the Shock were a tad bit lower in the sort of final rankings when compared to their previous seasons. I mean, if you don't win the championship, people just go a bit down on you. But I think, yeah, Nero did a great job. Kai was very, very good on the hit scan. Um, I think you may just see Venom come here and there, but we haven't really so far, and I think that's perfectly fine. Speedily will be joining them later as well, but I think Nero is perfectly serviceable in that Genji role. Kai is doing great on the hit scan. Iris actually surprised me at least with his. Sorry, was it Iris? No, it was Ultraviolet,
Ultraviolet.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ultraviolet actually looked insane. One of the best honors that we saw this week because he was obviously playing a great standard honor with insane aim, but he would also go for these risky hero plays with, like I said, hiding, anti-nading, and sleeping people, and that worked out really well for the Rain. I think he's a really good rookie prospect that's going to turn out quite well now that he's actually been seen in the eye test against fairly decent teams. I mean, at least their match against the Florida Mayhem was still a fair match, like uh, where I think Ultraviolet was one of the difference makers, and that's just a really big win, I think, for the Atlanta Rain. They did struggle with Iris in terms of flexibility last year, even though Iris somehow seems to have awakened his inner Ana player this year. And yeah, I think the Atlanta Rain is in a good spot. I was questioning their coaching a little bit, just because I'm still not super high on Steffi, based off of his weird, just the weird things revolving around him in the past. That said, the Atlanta Rain do generally look like they're well trained and they know how to execute their comps and they know how to execute their individual heroes really well. So yeah, I think it's a big dub for the Atlanta Rain this week, and that should continue. I think they're one of the teams that are at the very top of the NA region right now.
Yeah, for sure. I think Ultraviolet especially was just really impressive. Um, I was really high on him coming into this season. Naturally, after we watched him playing in any contenders, I also want to give an extra shout out to Shu actually, whom I noticed has developed this really good use for the nano boost. I think he's one of the few Anas, or maybe the only Ana that does this consistently, which is that when the enemy Ana uses a nano boost on someone, Shu uses his nano defensively to protect the person that has just been hard committed on by the enemy's nano target. And he ends up pocketing them like really hard, saving them, and just turning the fight around. And I don't think I've seen any other Ana do that consistently, so just huge props to Shu. But yeah, Ultraviolet, you've impressed me as well. So, like, huge props to both flex supports. Uh, let's move on and talk about two of the losers from week one. And I'll let you go first here, Nightwing. Which was your pick?
So I think one of the losers has to be the Boston Uprising for me. I think while nobody was super high on this team, I think this team showed potential, but then they also showed how they completely just wasted that potential because um, they were putting Valentine on Tracer. When they had Striker, who's an incredibly solid Tracer player, uh, I mean, more than solid. I mean, he's a great Tracer player. I mean, when Striker swapped to Tracer, you could see he instantly killed the enemy backline. He's that good. But they kept forcing Valentine on the Tracer, which I just do not think was a great idea. Victoria looked very shaky and kind of nervous, honestly, in the Widow matchup. Uh, Even if they did actually like give like a decent fight to the teams when they would play that Widow on maps like the Circuit Royale, which, by the way, seems to be a fairly Widow favored map actually. Many teams are choosing to play the Widow over there, apart from obviously the funny Florida Mayhem strat that we'll talk about later. Um, so I think the Boston Uprising are sort of confused in what their identity is. Uh, by far, Like it wasn't even close. The amount of substitutions that Boston made in their match, I think it was their first match against the Vancouver Titans, where they went 3-2, almost losing to the Titans. That match, they would make every substitution available to them in the book. I think they had every single one of their tanks play. It's all Marvel Punk. Uh, Marvel was the only one that actually looked decent because he was playing a pretty good Doom. And I think that's probably something that the Boston Uprising need to lean into if they want any success in the future. Because the other two tanks didn't look like very inspiring. They were also trying out a weird diva comp, which I think many other teams did not go for. I think that also indicates to me that like they've just not been scrimming hard enough, in my opinion, because that's not a comp that really worked out very well for any team that tried it, and it was just the Boston Uprising and one other team that actually tried that comp. So I think the Boston Uprising are still quite lost, if I'm being honest. They need to use the tools that they have on hand because currently it seems like they're just not very sure of what to do. Their flex substitutions between uh, Brimzo and MCD, is it? Uh,
Hmm.
that's been quite uninspiring as well because that just throws off the entire communication dynamic that you have with the team. And honestly, I would just like to see Crimson win. I don't need to see MCD played for the rest of the season, if I'm being honest. I think they should just find one roster that works for them. I think it should probably be Striker always in, Marvel always in, Crimson always in, and they should just be running with that sort of comp. Because right now, I think a lot of the roster is honestly being let down by the decision making of the coaching. Uh, so yeah, I think the Boston Uprising takes a big L for this week in my eyes, almost losing to the Vancouver Titans, and getting rolled by the LA Gladiators as well. So yeah,
Yeah, all very good points there. And my loser for week one is actually going to be the Paris Eternal. Now, they had two games, one of them against the San Francisco Shock, which I think all of us knew they had no chance of winning, so I don't really blame them for that. But even the performance in that game was just really lackluster. Um, I was expecting a lot more from, especially the tank and support lines. I think, like on DPS, Glister was like fairly disappointing, as I did expect. Naga actually had a pretty good Genji. Um, I think the supports still have a lot to figure out about how to play in this Overwatch 2 setup because I think they were used to a lot of peel from Westola last season, and that's why they feel a little less self-sufficient. Um, Although I think Khan is still a really fantastic Ana player, and I think on the tank end, right, I think because of how clearly defined Dan and Vestola's roles were last year, they are still having trouble adjusting to the solo tank playstyle. I think Dan did look decent in patches, but I think Vestola still needs to figure out how to play honestly a more aggressive tank. I think he was a little bit too passive. He like the moments when he was aggressive, the timing was just off. So I think that needs to be corrected. They did do a little bit better against the Florida Mayhem, but I think against a team that is not very consistent like Florida, at least from what we've seen so far, they should have had a closer game. I was expecting them to take it up to map 5, but they just couldn't manage to do that. And I think for a team from which we expected a decent showing, um, at least early on in the season, the Paris Eternal had a pretty disappointing week one. So they were my losing pick for week one. I think they were really close with BNYXL, who actually looked a little bit more decent, which is why I put them not in the losers section. But yeah, that's my pick. Um, should we move on and talk about our predictions for week two, Nightwing?
yeah, let's go ahead.
All right. So there are two games in particular that Nightwing and I want to talk about because we do realize if we talk about 9 games, you're going to be bored to hell. So yeah, let's just talk about the two highlight games of week two. Starting off with the matchup between the Houston Outlaws and the San Francisco Shock. Um, yeah, what are your general comments on this matchup, Nightwing? Because I think it's going to be a pretty huge game in general for both these teams.
I think this is a real test for both of these teams, especially from the Houston POV. It's because they did 3-0 the Dallas Fuel last week, which was quite impressive, but then they got figured out by the Toronto Defiant when they played that tracer comp to counter Dante's Doom's aggression and also keep a check on Pelican's Echo. So I think the Houston Outlaws have to show whether or not Piggy can provide any help in terms of playing a different play style where they can adapt, or they need to just hard commit to this Doom style and actually find a way to work around that tracer counter. Because otherwise, the Shock has Proper, who looked insane on the tracer when he played it for a short time against the two lower tier teams this past week. So I think Houston, they do have to just figure out what to do in this situation. I think Dante has to pick up some points up from Get Quicked On as well as Hawk, where he has to play that more disciplined style. He has to hold space instead of just going for frags, because once you lose that tank in Overwatch 2, it's easy to roll the squishy players, especially if you have your own tank still alive. So I think that's something that Houston Outlaws need to work on. They do have a good coaching staff, but I think that this just needs to go in like their heads, that they have to work on like making this Doom comp work, because right now this comp is basically their entire source of feast and famine. So yeah, that's the POV from the Houston Outlaws side. For the Shock, I think this is the real test for the Shock, because right now people are putting them up in power rankings and they're obviously up in standings as well. But they beat down on some very poor teams, if I'm being honest, that weren't that did not have a lot of expectations to begin with. I think Kaluj looked kind of shaky on tank, honestly, even though they did dominate, because like he would keep getting CC'd and he would keep getting pinned and charged and slept. So I think in that sense, I think Kaluj, while he can use that sacrificial Sardo strategy, I think you also do have to keep in mind that you have to mechanically outplay your enemies even as a tank now. So I think I want to see his Winston gameplay improve still. I want it to be competitive, and I want to see what he can do against the Houston Outlaws. I think I'm expecting great things out of Proper already, but Kilo and Sam are still going to have to show up. Sam did look really good on the Genji when he did play, but I hope that continues into this next week. Kilo honestly wasn't as impressive as I expected. And I think the matchup against Merit, his own teammate, will be a really good eye test to tell how good Kilo is actually going to be in this season. Um, Especially as a rookie hit scan, right? Because he does not have a lot of flexibility, so he has to dominate on the role that he's put in on. Otherwise, he's not going to be so much of an Ans story and more of a Victoria esque story for him this year. So I think it's just a really important match for both of these teams. They also have two flex supports. Like they have one flex support on each side that's playing the Lucio. I think both of them have to prove that they can actually play that role to a good degree. Uh, I think I'm fairly confident in the flex support players for both teams, though. So I think a lot of it comes down to which team can execute the right playstyle, which team can counter the enemy's playstyle, especially with the Houston Outlaws getting countered by Tracer, etc. So I think this is a really important match for both teams.
Yeah, I think you covered pretty much all of the points there. But just a little addition to this is that I think with the Outlaws kind of showing all of their cards in week one, they have sort of revealed that there are maps where they definitely want to play Dante, and if they do play Dante, he's probably just going to play the Doom. And like you said, Niping, the Toronto Defiant already kind of figured out how to counter that composition, and the Shock are a team that's equipped to do that even better than the Defiant, at least at this point. So it's definitely an advantage for the Shock, which is why both of us have predicted Shock to win 3-1. Uh, I think Outlaws still do have that sort of upset potential, at least on a map, because I think they do have a lot of mechanical skill with Merit and Pelican. Um, they do have that consistency advantage in the sense that they are definitely going to be running those two DPS players, because I don't think they are interested in running Dante at the either of the DPS spots right now, which I think is a wise decision. Um, I think the shock did look a little more cohesive than the Outlaws last week, especially with Koluj kind of fitting in with, like, at least kind of settling in with the shock and understanding their playstyle. He does have some holes in his armor right now, but I think he can patch them over time. Um, Proper is naturally an absolute beast, and with his tracer, there's no doubt in my mind that the Outlaws will face a difficult time if they play those Doom compositions. And yeah, I think it's going to be a really fun match to watch. And I think even though the Shock have a clear edge over here, the Outlaws do have some room to make some outplays. So 3-1 should be a fair decision in this regard. Let's talk about the second game that we had in mind, which was the LA Gladiators versus the Dallas Fuel, which happens on day two, on night two, as you can see for us. Um, So, Nightwing and I have differing opinions in this regard. I have predicted, as you guys can see on my screen, that the Gladiators will beat the Fuel 3-2. Nightwing feels that the Fuel will beat the Gladiators 3-1. Now, I'll just quickly go over my reasons for this. I feel in general that the Gladiators had a more consistent showing over the two games this past week, and also showcased more skill and more flexibility. Um, I do think that especially the Doom compositions were a lot better than Dallas's Doom compositions. Fearless looked quite clueless on Doom, if I'm being honest. And I do feel like the Gladiators DPS line has been much more stable and had a much better rotation in place as well than the Dallas Fuel. I mean, Dallas just put in Edison and Sparkle all the time. Like, sure, Sparkle's Genji is really good, but Edison's hit scan was honestly quite shaky, and even Sparkle couldn't make as many plays as he normally does on the Genji. So I think the Fuel still have a bit of stuff to figure out. I think if they play exclusively those Winston comps, they can bridge the gap a whole lot against the Gladiators. Maybe they can even beat the Gladiators. It's not impossible in my eyes, but I just think right now the Gladiators have just looked better and more consistent. So I think they will probably edge out in this matchup. What are your thoughts, Nightwing? Why have you put the Fuel as the winner?
I think the fact of the matter is that the like one of the main reasons is because I don't like Parafan on the Genji, honestly. I think he didn't look that great. And when they put in Kevster on the Genji, then they put in Ans. Uh, the other fact of the matter is that they lost on Circuit Royale to the NYXL with Flora on Widow. And Ans just straight up lost the Widow matchup, which I think is kind of sad if you're relying on him to be your Widow player, right? Uh, and in that sense, like Edison actually had a good second game where he there was a complete shutout on Route 66 against a pretty good Widow player like Happy against the Washington Justice. I think it has been reported that the Dallas Fuel had, stage fright and nerves during that first match, and you could see that in the lack of decisiveness in that first match. However, in the second match, you could see it was almost a completely different Dallas Fuel that were almost completely dominating the Justice. And I think that's what's going to happen in this online match against the Gladiators as well, where the Dallas Fuel do have that advantage where I think Anand is still struggling to find his place. Sparkle is definitively a better Genji than Padafan and is very, very competitive with obviously Kevster as well. I think the fact of the matter is also that like Reiner is not a very solid uh, monkey player like compared to Fearless, and that seems to be the meta comp going forward. I don't think the Dallas Fuel should be playing that Zarya comp where they keep forcing Hanbin onto Zarya, and they should not be playing Fearless on the Doom. Uh, Hopefully, Fearless's Doom should improve in the future. However, I think at the moment, as long as the Dallas Fuel stay in their lane, they play their own monkey comp, and Edison actually is provided space, I think they have a decent potential in order to pop off, because the Gladiators seem a bit all over the place right now. They're relying on their rookie talent and Patafan, but he ends up feeding in a lot of fights. If I'm being honest, they do have good tools with Shu, obviously, who is a really good honor player. However, Fielder is no slouch either, and honestly, like Chio is a really really solid player as well. I think in terms of any other map outside of Circuit Royale where Arns might potentially win Gladiators the matchup, and that's why I've given them one pity map. The Dallas Fuel should have more tempo and just a faster pace to play with. That's something that you saw the Houston Outlaws actually excelled with, is because they win by playing a very high paced comp, right? And I think that's where the Dallas Fuel can actually succeed, because they are used to that playing that aggressive Genji style. So that's why I think the Dallas Fuel should be able to clutch it out. However, I think this will be a really good test for both teams, because right now they're both in this like cycle of misery right now, where pretty much considered equal to Houston, Toronto, Justice, and the Dallas Fuel and the Gladiators as well. So I think if these teams want to break out, then they have to prove themselves in this upcoming match.
Yep, and I think we'll see a lot of stuff being unraveled in week two and just figure out how consistent some of these teams are going to be, how much they're going to learn from their mistakes, how well they're going to read enemy strategies and compositions. And I think week two is really where you start to see patterns forming in the different regions in the league. Naturally, we haven't gotten to see APAC play yet, which I am excited for. It's still a couple of weeks away, but I think in the meantime, we do have 9 really fun looking games to indulge in and just enjoy as an audience. So, uh, we would love for you guys as well to share your thoughts on our predictions for these two games as well as any other games. And also let us know in the comments why you think I'm right about Gladiators beating Fuel and Nightwing is wrong, which I would really appreciate. But on that note, I think that's all we had to discuss, right, Nightwing? Any further points?
I mean, you can't miss the very very interesting uh, ruling made by the Overwatch League about that Florida rollout, uh, where they made that incredibly funny May and Symmetra TP over the spawn of Circuit Royale, and just absolutely bodied the enemy team. So I think that was really fun to watch. Um, Obviously, there has been a ruling that you can't use those sort of points, especially with the May wall with the Sim TP. I think hopefully some changes are addressed so that some of these funny exploits can be used. However, it's also not exactly fun to be a defender and have to prepare for that weird rollout every time. So I can see why the league went with this at the current moment. So I think there's a balance that has to be struck, because obviously a lot of techniques that you use in the Overwatch League, or at least in Overwatch in general. For example, this tank Doomfist does have a lot of new techniques that you might actually consider exploits to some degree. So I hope that there is a balance struck between fun and competitive integrity, just so that innovative plays can also be rewarded, even if uh, game breaking plays are not. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to mention.
Yeah, it was really fun seeing Florida coming out with that start on Circuit Royale because it's something that we have also seen in Overwatch 1 on Icon World, right, with the May and Sim. I'm assuming you can still do that in Overwatch 2 as well at the very same spot, but I guess that won't be allowed in the league. Um, it's Look, this might be a hot take, right? But I feel like competitive integrity is actually broken when one team has an unfair advantage over the other. Um, I think as long as both teams are trying, they have access to the same pool of resources from the game's end, like essentially from the developers. I think it's still going to be fair game. I understand if you can't use like certain exploits like I don't know. I really can't think of an example over here, but I don't think it's wrong comparatively to use something like that sim strat, because it's there in the game, and clearly both teams can use it. It's just that Florida was like they thought of it, they were creative enough to discover it, and it was just fun to see. And I think like the greatest benefit that came out of that strategy was not for the Florida Mayhem, but instead for all the fantasy Overwatch players that had Florida's players on their teams or even Paris's players, because they are going to get probably double the points. Like we are not sure how that's going to work, but yeah, it. I'm interested to see if Blizzard patches that like for the league and as the beta as well. I don't think they're going to, but we'll just wait and see. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all we have to discuss. So thanks a lot for listening, guys, and we will see you sometime next week where we will talk about week two and just share our predictions for week three. And I guess wait, the Eastern region begins in week three as well, right? So we're just like 1 week away. That's exciting.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, we're just 1 week away from watching Shanghai dominate APAC, which is going to be fun. Potentially some fun signings coming up for the Charge as well, which we'll talk about when they're confirmed. Uh, but yeah, the APAC region is also going to be fun to watch. But for this upcoming week, I think that Houston Shock game is probably something that you should keep your eyes on the most.
Yeah, I mean, and the Guangzhou Chargers games are really not far away anymore. Okay, I'm just gonna let that sink in. And yep, thanks a lot for listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye bye.